with that, my name's Courtney Williams. I helped to found Westchester Alliance for Sustainable Solutions. Basically, I live in Peekskill. I can see the Wheelabrator towers from my window, and at night it wakes me up with the noise. And when we walk by the riverfront, we can smell it. And so given the tremendous amount of air pollution that it generates, being the #1 source of air pollution in Westchester County, when Mike from Energy Justice Network reached out offering their help to mobilize the community to find actually sustainable solutions to our waste, I jumped at the opportunity. And we have several WAS folks on this call with us, including our Westchester organizer, Jonathan. And so we held a film screening back in May that was well attended and co-sponsored by Federated Conservationists of Westchester County, Riverkeeper, Groundwork Hudson Valley, Sustainable Westchester, Bedford 2030, Grassroots Environmental Education. I'm not sure if I'm missing any other orgs. And we screened a film called The Sacrifice Zone. And after that, there was a very lively community discussion on how to get Westchester to zero waste and shut down our incinerator. And out of that discussion became the idea came to tour the trash incinerator. And Ann Jaffe Holmes from FCWC took on trying to find a time that they would agree to let us come tour the facility. And that was supposed to be on Friday, but due to a deferred outage, they have canceled for Friday and switched us now to July 8th. So we'll see if that happens. Given the extreme age of this incinerator, the fact that it needs a lot of maintenance and has outages and things like that are not really surprising. But so in advance of that tour, we wanted to provide folks, given we know that that Wheelabrator greenwashes a lot of their work, making it seem like burning garbage is a good solution to the copious amounts of waste that we generate. So we wanted to kind of prepare folks with a more unvarnished view and set of factual information about how trash incinerators operate and kind of prepare ourselves for what we're going to see. And so to that end, we have with us Mike Ewall from Energy Justice Network to kind of hold a teach-in for us so that we understand what we're going to be seeing, what the kind of euphemisms are for the pollution and the way they generate ash and all of these things. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Mike. And you're on mute still, Mike.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Courtney. So I have a PowerPoint lined up. I made like a briefer than usual version of it, but it still will take a little time. If anyone has questions during it, since while I'm sharing my screen, I won't be able to see the chat. You can feel free to speak up if it's relevant to the slides that I'm on, or drop things in the chat and we can handle the questions later. Either way is welcome. So I'm gonna just jump in and share my screen. Okay, everyone can see that?
Yep, we can see it.
Cool. All right. So first of all, if you want to find information on why trash incineration is a terrible idea, go to our website, energyjustice.net/incineration. We have a lot of fact sheets and other materials at the top of that page and other resources throughout. Now, this is the latest map I just made today of where the incinerators are in the country. There are 2 that just shut down in Western Massachusetts, yay, in recent months, and another in Hartford closing down in about a week. But that big cluster is still crazy. So we're in the middle of the big corridor of trash incinerators in the US, and New York is now tied with Florida for the dubious position of being #1 in the number of trash incinerators. There are 10 incinerators in the state of New York right now for trash. Now, the good news is that I'm about to come out with a new version of the slide, and it's going to be even lower. It's going to be down to 70, soon 78, from 71 to 68. We'll be down to 68 trash incinerators left in the country, and there are others that look like they'll be closing. So this number keeps falling every year, which is wonderful news. Now, the lifespan of incinerators is not that much time left for most of them. Most of them are in their 30s now. About 6 have made it past their 40th birthday. The one in Peekskill is 38 now. And the oldest ones have made it to the ripe old age of 47. But of the 47, different number 47, the 47 that have closed, and that I didn't finish updating the slide, through 2022, so through last month, their average age was just 24 years now. The older ones are starting to close. It was 23, now it's 24. So incinerators are often described with any word other than the I word. The industry in the meetings has even called it the I word, and they try to avoid using that term. So they used to call it trash to steam, and we like to correct that because we're not just throwing ice cubes in our trash cans. So it's not just water vapor coming out of smokestacks. It wouldn't need air permits if it were. So it's actually trash to toxic ash and toxic air emissions, but no things are turning trash into steam. They also use the term waste to energy a lot, and we like to rebrand that waste of energy, because if you actually recycled and composted the same materials that are in trash, the latest study on this, which is getting old now, but the only one I'm aware of, shows that it saves 3 to 5 times more energy than what you can get back by burning it. And that's because if you take, say, this piece of paper right here, and you imagine all the energy it took to chop down the tree with fossil fuels, to ship that to a paper mill, to burn coal or maybe tires or other things in it to power that paper mill, and then just ship it to a Staples store and you buy it. All that energy it took that went out of chainsaws and smokestacks and truck exhausts, you can't get the energy back. It's called embodied energy. So you can save that energy by recycling that paper, but you can't get it back by burning it because it's not in that paper anymore. And so that's why we consider them waste of energy facilities, but they still use that WTE term for waste to energy. And I'd like to point out that that is not even scientifically accurate of a term. I try to urge reporters and activists to scrub this from their vocabulary, because it's not even possible to turn matter into energy without a nuclear reaction. Thankfully, that's not what they're doing. So they're just basically changing the form and location of it by turning it into ash and air pollution, but they're not turning it into energy in a literal sense. That's one way you can convince reporters to stop repeating public relations terms, is just point out that's not even scientifically valid of a term. Now, trash incinerators, I've argued, are the most expensive way to manage waste or to make energy, but also the most polluting way to do each one. So there are 4 arguments there, and I'll walk you through them each. The 4 arguments are ones that I also made, this is 9 years ago now, before DC City Council, sitting right next to the mouthpiece for the trash incinerator industry, which is Ted Michaels. He's the president of Energy Recovery Council, which is the at least 3rd name of the Trash Incinerator Industries Trade Association. And he admitted on the record, and this is on video, that I was right about half of the points that I made, one of them being that they're the most expensive way to manage waste. And this is his direct quote. And you can see that he's saying that if you had, they like to call them waste energy facilities, next to a landfill, that you would think the landfill is going to be cheaper, because incinerators are very capital intensive. So this is the own industry admitting that, and there are other industry admissions of this, plus just data from the real world. One of the other industry admissions is from this other trade association. It's representing the private waste industry, and that's the National Solid Waste Management Association. And last time they did any analysis of this, they found that incineration on a nationwide basis was more expensive than landfill. Now, when we compare it to energy, because they love to say they're energy facilities, even though they're predominantly waste facilities, the latest data from the federal government, and sorry this is getting old, but they stopped looking at trash incinerators in the newer reports because no one's building new ones. So the report with the 2012 data is the newest one available. And they found that trash incineration is the most expensive way to build or to operate and maintain a plant that makes electricity. And I find this fascinating because this kind of gets at the difference between a waste and a fuel. You would think that's, in other words, they get paid to take what is their fuel, would have very cheap operations and maintenance because it's offset by getting paid to take their fuel. But no, it's still the most expensive because of the pollution control equipment that they have to have on these facilities. And they're still very polluting even with that. But that's the main difference between a waste and a fuel, is which direction the money flows. With nuclear power plants, with coal, oil, and gas, they have to pay to get their fuel, but trash incinerators get paid to take what is essentially their fuel, and they're still extremely expensive. Now, they're not only capital intensive, but they often in their contracts have what are called put or pay clauses, which say that local governments that they're contracting with have to give them a certain amount of waste or basically get punished if they don't. So there will be a certain amount of tonnage per year that if the county doesn't supply that amount of waste, Wheelabrator can then take waste from somewhere else and fill that same capacity and get paid again by the county to not burn their trash for trash they're not getting. And at the same time that Wheelabrator gets paid twice, the county is paying twice because the county has to pay once to do the right thing, to reduce, reuse, recycle, or compost what people are discarding, and then pay again to not use Wheelabrator. So it's a very terrible disincentive to do the right thing. And there are actually 29 towns that filed for bankruptcy because of a Wheelabrator put or pay clause in their contract in Claremont, New Hampshire. This happened in the mid-90s. And those towns were forced to pay up by the court. They were not allowed to go bankrupt because of those contracts, even though they were having that effect on those local governments. So they also have a problem in that they compete with not just the zero waste solutions, they compete with clean energy in mostly other states. This is less of an issue for New York at the moment because New York was smart enough to not give renewable energy credits to trash incinerators, even though the industry tried 3 times and the state argued back and opposed that. But on the federal level, there are incentives, and it's possible that they can always get more incentives by arguing that they're renewable energy. Now, one of the things that we thought was, sorry, I'll get to that in the next slide. Let me hit this next point. It's different. The incentive that trash incinerators have to get different types of waste causes them to try to take things that are more dangerous. So right now in Wheelabrator and Hudson Falls, and the northernmost of the 3 they have on the Hudson, they are taking a lot of industrial waste and tires from multiple states and even Canada. And that's one of the ways that they make themselves more profitable. A lot of them will take pharmaceuticals and they brag about it and make a big deal about how they're solving the pharmaceutical waste problem by doing so. They'll also take profile waste like guns and drugs that police collect. And in Connecticut right now, they're trying at one of their incinerators, this is Covanta, their competitor, to burn medical waste because they can get paid about 7 times more dollars per ton, about $550 a ton, burning medical waste, which they're already doing. That company is at 3 other plants in the country. So we've seen this over and over in different communities where they try to take, even if it's just a portion of something that's a much more dangerous industrial waste, because it pays more per ton. And that's one way that this uneconomical industry is trying to monetize themselves. And you'd think that they'll be doing this more in a state like New York, where they don't get renewable energy credits, and they probably are going to be struggling over time. They're also having a hard time competing with natural gas on the electricity sales side. Now that their long-term power purchase agreements from years ago have expired in most incinerators, they have a hard time competing. And one of the main things keeping Wheelabrator Westchester going is that instead of mostly selling electricity, they sell a lot of steam. They're selling this in a contract with White Plains Linen, which has a long-term contract, I think, for the same length of time as the county's waste contract. So until I think it's 2029 or 2030, they are buying steam from Wheelabrator, and that pays a lot better. There are other incinerators that when they lose their steam sales contracts, they actually shut down because they can't afford to keep operating. So that's very significant. Now, we used to think that incinerators compete with recycling because they need to burn things that burn well, like paper and plastics. Well, when I was on a tour of the Wheelabrator incinerator in Baltimore, which is the same size plant, this is a handful of years ago, they told me that actually, no, they compete more with composting. They want the wet stuff that doesn't burn as well. Because when they get too much plastics, and we've seen this from their competitor Cavanta as well in recent years, arguing that they get too much plastic, so they love plastic recycling now, because their boilers are rated at a certain amount of BTUs per hour, a certain amount of energy value that they can burn at a time where they hit their limit and can't take more waste. So they would rather have things that don't burn as well as plastics, especially if it's wet like compostables, because then they could feed more waste through and get more tons through, and they get paid per ton. They also get paid for their energy, but apparently the tonnage is more significant if that's their tactic. So earlier I compared them to other types of power plants in terms of cost, and I alluded to this about being dirtier than other forms of energy. So we all know that coal plants are about the dirtiest thing that's out there. So I don't do this comparison and make people think, gee, coal plants are a great idea. We all know coal plants are filthy, but what shocks people is to know how much worse trash incinerators actually are compared to coal plants. Now, I'm sorry, I should have put in a slide because there's New York specific data that would have been great to show. I can drop it in the chat later. But this is a national analysis I did several years ago. We're working on a new one that'll have additional pollutants and look at the whole country on this. But last time I analyzed it, I found that on all the pollutants I looked at, trash incinerators per unit of energy were more polluting than coal power plants, even though they tend to be younger and have additional pollution control devices on them that coal plants generally have not had. And when the New York DEC did a similar analysis in 2011, and they looked at the 8 coal power plants in New York versus the 10 trash incinerators that are here, the 8 coal plants, which are all shut down now, but the 10 trash incinerators are all still here, the coal plants were less dirty than the incinerators. The incinerators, actually, the 14 times under mercury, that's from the New York data. 6 is the national one. But the New York data, which was more specific, showed that it's 14 times more mercury per unit of energy. So even though those coal plants are much bigger plants, even if you don't adjust for size, there was more mercury coming out of the incinerators in New York than of all the coal plants combined at the time. Now, when I confronted the industry with this back at the hearing I was mentioning earlier in DC, they couldn't wiggle out of this. When I compare them to coal plants, all of a sudden that's an unfair thing to do. And they say, oh, well, you can't compare us to other power plants. Waste to energy plants are primarily solid waste facilities. Electricity output is a secondary function. Even though they bend over backwards to talk about how they're renewable energy, they rename themselves Energy Recovery Council. They get some incinerators to be branded power plants and not waste incinerators to dodge certain regulations. So it's convenient how they switch back and forth when it works for them. This here is the last analysis I did. We're doing a new one that will come out soon on CO2 emissions from trash incinerators. And the last analysis showed that they're about 2.5 times as bad as coal burning per unit of energy. The newer data we're finding from New York specifically says about 80% worse, so almost twice. So it's not as bad as this shows if the newer data is more accurate. We're still analyzing that to see which one is more correct. But either way, it's still on the order of about twice as bad as coal for the climate. Now, they're also bad for public health in a lot of other ways. Dioxins, which you see the dioxin molecule there in the corner, that's the most toxic variant of dioxin. And it's literally known by EPA to be 140,000 times more toxic than mercury, for which there's also no safe dose. And it causes so many different health effects. I only listed some of the more popular ones in that second bullet point here. But one of the interesting things about this is this pollutant, like mercury also does once it hits the water body and becomes fat soluble, it loves fat and hates water. So it climbs up the food chain straight out of the smokestack. It'll start doing this. It doesn't have to hit water like mercury does first. And 93% of your exposure to it because of this comes from eating meat and dairy. The amount you get from breathing is insignificant compared to how much you're getting in your diet. And the dietary sources are so significant that if you were standing in a farm field next to a grazing cow, it would take you 14 years to inhale as much dioxin as that cow will ingest in one day of grazing, the dioxin that just rests on the grass, if they're grass-fed, that they're eating in that field. And the highest exposures people get are infants. If they're breastfeeding and also across the placenta, they get about 1/6 of the lifetime dose of dioxin just from infancy.
Oh my God, this Wheelabrator stuff is really depressing. It's awful.
Yes, good motivation to get it shut down. This
I
slide,
didn't know I was muted. I'm sorry.
that's okay. This slide here is actually what inspired me to go from vegetarian to vegan. This is from EPA's dioxin reassessment, which they never completed, but it came out in 1994. And I think politics have kept this from coming out, in part because it would make it clear that there is no meat or dairy in the country that is safe to eat anymore, because dioxin from incinerators and other sources has contaminated the food chain extremely. And this is based on the amount in the food times how much people tend to eat of that food in North America. And you'll see all the top choices of the top, 7 categories here before you hit inhalation are all meat and dairy products. So every community that I work with, basically, that is dealing with a smokestack issue tends to hear the same story. I'm calling it now the smokestack story. And that story goes a little bit like this. Anyone with a smokestack will say, don't worry, we have continuous emissions monitors, and we'll know what's coming out of our smokestack at all times. And the state will have this data, and they'll make sure that we don't go over those limits, because they'll fine us very heavily if we do. And those limits mean it's healthy and safe. And when you see our data, you'll see that we're 99% below this limit and 94% below this other limit. I just heard this in another meeting today from a different smokestack company with a sewage sludge incinerator. It's a very common argument. And I want to undress the emperor here, and I'll walk backwards through this, because you're going to hear some of this on the tour. And it's important to know how to poke holes through their arguments. Not that you need to argue with them, but at least in your head, you should understand why they're telling you what they're telling you and how it's misleading on purpose. So the first thing to understand is that the emissions limits are not based on health and safety. We've had at least 2 state regulators admit this to us. One of them we have on video in Pennsylvania, and they'll tell you it's not a health-based standard. It's based on what the technology is able to do. And that's why you have different standards for different types of burners, different types of fuels. And it's not based on health and safety at all. They are also concentration based. So if you have a 500 ton per day trash incinerator, it's going to be allowed in the permit to release a certain amount of pollution. But if you have one that's 2,250 tons per day, like you do, which is more than 4 times as large, it will be allowed to be putting out more than 4 times as much pollution, because it's a bigger facility. That's because in the permit, all the emissions limits are concentration based, the parts per million, or nanograms per dry standard cubic meter. So it depends on how many millions and how many cubic meters you have coming out. And if they have more because they're burning more tons, then they're allowed to put more pollution into the community. It's not like there's a fixed amount that is healthy and safe, and they're not allowed to cross that limit. And if it did work that way, they would be looking at the fact that there are also other polluters around, which they don't do. The fact is that they don't permit things as if, well, they do permit things as if they're on the moon. Like, they don't permit things looking at the cumulative impacts of other facilities. There's also the fact that there's no safe dose of a lot of chemicals like mercury, lead, dioxins, and there's several more in that list, where there is no amount that they can say, you can put this into the air and people in the community can breathe or eat it or drink it and it won't affect them. That's just not true for a number of chemicals. So they set limits that are achievable by the industry that won't be too expensive for them, but not based on how much the community can absorb without a health consequence. It's also true that these standards are old, that they're a few decades old, and the EPA was supposed to update them and has not done so in more recent years like they're required to. So they have weaker standards than if they built this new. If they built this incinerator in the past decade, they would have to shut down tomorrow because they would not be able to meet the limits for nitrogen oxides. And there should, if they updated the standards, be other limits that they would also not be able to meet. And in other countries, some of the other countries where incinerators exist, they have stricter limits as well. So we just tend to have weaker standards and apply old standards because it's an old facility. Oh, sorry, jumped over something. So going to the second bullet point for a second, the companies will always argue that state regulators are very strict enforcers and they'll fine them very heavily. And when you look at the track record of fines, you often find that there are violations that get issued with 0 fines. And if they do get fines, sometimes they can negotiate them down. And I found in Pennsylvania, the original amount of the fine is not even public information. We're not allowed to get that information. We're only allowed to find out what they ultimately got fined. So imagine if you get stopped speeding on the highway and the officer pulls you over and says, okay, here's a ticket for $120. You're like, well, how about I pay 30? Well, that's what Wheelabrator and other companies are doing all the time. And they get to pay the 30. And you don't even get to know that the original fine was going to be 120. So this is happening. And the fine amounts are not enough to change their behavior. It's the cost of doing business. They will sometimes, I've seen files of incinerators where every quarter when they hand in their continuous emissions monitoring data, there will be a check for the violations they had that quarter, and they give it to the state agency. And then there's another check the next quarter and another check the next quarter. It's just the cost of doing business, but it doesn't change what they do and cause them to stop violating the limits. So the final place where the emperor is wearing no clothes, and you're going to see this on the tour of Wheelabrator, you'll see a control room where there'll be a number of monitors, and it'll look like they really know what they're doing. They have a lot. It looks like a NASA control room, just in miniature, and you see these different things beeping and showing them stuff, and you'll think they really know what's going on. They must know what's coming out of the smokestack. And when they talk about continuous monitoring, they make you think that it's for everything, but in reality, it's only for 3 pollutants. Most pollutants, they really don't know what's coming out most of the time because they're not tested. So aside from the fact that some companies actually have rigged their stack test data, the annual ones, and also have been caught violating or tampering with their continuous monitors. So sometimes the data is not even honest, but let's assume for a moment that it is. The testing that they're doing only applies to a few things. So if we regulated motorists on the highway, the way we regulate smokestacks in this country for most pollutants, we would let people drive all year with no speedometer. And once a year on the highways, there will be speed traps, and there will be signs saying, warning, slow down, speed trap ahead. And the brother of the driver will be running the speed trap because the companies do their own testing. They hire their own consultants to do it. Sometimes the state might be watching them, but oftentimes they're short-staffed and not even present. So this is literally how most things are monitored, if they're monitored at all. And what's so appalling about this is that the technology exists to monitor over 50 different pollutants on a continuous basis. And yet they only have to monitor 3 on a continuous basis, plus a few other things that are not actually pollutants, like how dark the emissions are, oxygen, and temperature. So they'll brag about that and say, we monitor 6 things continuously. And then the rest of them, about 8 more pollutants roughly, will get tested 1 time a year under a best behavior test that they know are coming up because they're doing it themselves. And we know from studies in Europe that in one study, when they test dioxins with continuous sampling technology, the actual emissions are 30 to 50 times higher than what we think they are in the US when they test once a year during a normal stack test. A newer study found it was actually about 600 to 1100 times higher than what we think they are when they do that once a year test. And that's because dioxins, the most toxic chemicals known to science, are very temperature sensitive. So when you have startups, shutdowns, and malfunction times, their dioxins spike, but they're not allowed to do testing, the once a year stack test, under those conditions. They're required to do it under ideal operating conditions. So they don't even see those spikes in the US. All right, let's say a bit about ash. Incinerators are not alternatives to landfills. Incinerators mean you get both. You get an incinerator and a landfill. In your case, the landfill is in the community of Putnam, Connecticut, where they've been fighting for many years. I actually first met with that community 2 or 3 community groups ago in the 90s when they were fighting them. And now currently a newer community group is trying to stop a massive expansion that is getting approved. And it's going to be 10 times bigger of an expansion than the whole state of Connecticut needs for their remaining incinerators. So a lot of this is to serve New York, New England, and elsewhere. So incinerators require landfills for their ash. And for every 100 tons you burn, you get about 30 tons of toxic ash. And that ash can blow off of trucks when it drives through Peekskill and through the county to Connecticut. It can blow off the top of the landfill when they use it, not just when they're dumping it actively, but as landfill cover material which means they're covering ash with ash. Historically, they cover landfills with soil at the end of the day, so toxic, dangerous things don't blow into the community, but ash is now allowed to be used as landfill cover for normal landfills and for ash landfills, so it can cover itself. And that's one of the most dangerous things because fine particles that are toxic can blow into the community. And the reason I have coffee grounds pictured here is that it's an analogy that if you took coffee beans and pour water over them, you're not going to get coffee, right? But you grind them up and increase their surface area, and now you get coffee. But in a landfill, it's called leachate. And so if you took this phone, for example, it's in my hand here, and you chuck this straight in a landfill, it's going to take a really long time before any toxic metals or halogenated chemicals in here can get into my body by me breathing, eating, or drinking it. But if you burn it, you're instantly taking much of it and putting it into the air. And the rest is now in a form of ash where it can blow places and be inhaled. But when rainwater hits it in a landfill, it now has a higher surface area and it can pull those metals out and leach them into the groundwater. And there are also toxic chemicals in there that weren't in the waste in the first place, like dioxins that get formed in the combustion process. And a lot of that gets concentrated in the ash. Okay, so incinerators are worse than directly using landfills. The issue is really whether you're going to have a landfill or you're going to have both, or if you're going to do zero waste and minimize landfilling in a more safe way than trying to save landfill space by burning things first. So when we studied incineration versus landfilling, here's what we found, or versus ash filling in one case. So we used the most comprehensive life cycle analysis software that's out there. It's called MEBCalc, and it's called the Monetizing Environmental Benefits Calculator. That's what it stands for. So it looks at these 9 different criteria on the left here. Separately, we analyzed the other economic and environmental justice criteria on the other side of the page. But I'll show you the data on what we saw from this analysis. The latest one we did was on a Covanta incinerator in Montgomery County, Maryland. And that's called the Montgomery County Resource Recovery Facility. So that's the big line you see on the left here. And the landfills one, we looked at hauling as much as, I think, 700 miles away to landfills. A lot of them were closer than that, but we took the composite of 10 different landfills. The hauling distance turned out to not be very significant. I'll show you that in a second. But what we found here is that the greenhouse gases from incinerating close to home were about twice that of landfilling further away. And that the human health impacts of the particulate matter, which is the heart attacks and strokes and cancers, are far greater. The smog formation that forms nitrogen oxide, so triggering asthma attacks, also much larger than the landfills. And the other human health impacts of toxics like birth defects and different immune system diseases, and the carcinogens, which are much smaller, but the cancer-causing portion also adds up to a lot more than the landfills. Actually, the cancer-causing portion is slightly bigger at the landfills, but toxics in general, much bigger from incineration. So all told, if you can add this all up, as economists are good at doing, the model was built by an economist, they can put a dollar on everything. If you add up all these effects with the latest way of doing that out there, you see that incineration in terms of health and environment is 3 times as bad as landfilling. And when we looked in that same study at how much of that is attributable to the transportation, which is the blue or black lines, depending on if it's truck or rail, because they have a rail-based system currently in that place, we found that for the landfills, it's only about 3% of the total impact, and smaller than that for the incinerator because there's just so much more emissions from that, so it's a smaller share. So when people, sometimes the local government folks will argue this, or the county government, probably in your case, that, oh, if we had to shut down the incinerator and truck it all the way to a landfill in Pennsylvania or somewhere, which is actually not very far for you anyway, they're going to act as if the additional trucking is a big deal. And you should know that it definitely is not. Even if you had to truck much, much greater distances, you will not approach the emissions that you get from burning it directly. So a little bit more on health, and then I think we'll get to the positive stuff here. So I won't read you this slide, but just know that a lot of chemicals that come out, each one causes a range of different health problems. So you can always come back to this as a resource or make this available to you. Now, the studies that are out there, I know Wheelabrator's competitor Covanta has put out a fact sheet that argues that the studies show that there's nothing to worry about. Don't worry, be happy. There are no connections between incinerators and health impacts in the community. So I looked into their footnotes and the footnotes of their footnotes and the things that they weren't looking at either. And I found they misrepresented some things, but they also skipped over a lot of stuff. And the latest, and all the studies I was able to find that found anything. And granted, there are a number of studies that don't find things. It's very hard to make a connection because pollutants move, people move, there are other polluting facilities. So it is hard to find connections in a study. But when they do, and when multiple studies do find a connection, that's when you have to think, well, gee, maybe there's something to this. And the types of health effects they found, most of them were cancers. They found is true for just cancer generally, but also for specific ones that you see listed here, as well as respiratory and cardiovascular diseases also elevated in communities near incinerators that, in this case, most of these studies are out of Europe because there are not a lot of studies in the US on this. Okay, moving on to the positive stuff. So zero waste, which I work with folks in the Zero Waste International Alliance. We actually work together on defining what this means internationally. It's an internationally peer-reviewed definition and is defined by not burning, period, and prioritizing that over minimizing landfill impacts, and the recognition that incineration is worse than landfilling, but we want to move away from them both. And what we often say when people react to, oh, zero waste is utopic. What are you, crazy? You can't get to zero. Well, we have a lot of policies that are about getting to zero. We have zero drug tolerance and zero safety defects and zero accidents in the workplace. And what boss out there is going to say, well, for our company this year, our goal is to injure 5 workers. You get left out of the room, right? No one would do that. But we do that with waste all the time by saying, well, our goal is to reach 30% or now 60% or whatever percent recycling in the county. And yet, if your goal is not 100%, then you're going to stop trying, right? So we need to have a policy that makes sure that it can actually get you at least to 90%, which is the operational definition of zero waste for certification purposes. And then you never keep trying, getting closer to that 100. So the zero waste hierarchy, which is something I developed that's now used as an international standard also through ZWIA, the Zero Waste International Alliance. It makes it clear that incineration and all of its variants are in the unacceptable category, but that we start at the top and prioritize redesigning, rethinking things before we get through all these additional steps. And most of these are obvious to you what they mean, so I'll point out the ones that are a little less obvious toward the end here, and I'll break it down a little bit differently here. So after you hit reduce, you hit the place where you need to source separate. So the reusables, which are only about 5% of what's in the discard stream, notice I didn't say waste stream, the 5% is worth about 50% of the value of what is being discarded. So having reuse as a step is very important. And then multi-stream recycling, single stream lowers the value. So if you separate the paper, that is going to be better. And then after you do all the reusables, recyclables, and compostables being separated, you still are going to have some things in the trash can. So the last couple steps in the hierarchy are, well, one is to research it and feed that information back at the top of the hierarchy so you can see, oh, gee, we have all these Keurig cups in our trash. What should we do about them? Let's get them to redesign this and make it reusable. And that's actually what happened in Italy when they did that. But the main steps that are the research ones, not the hierarchy, but the ones that are, you'll see material recovery there. And that means that you actually mechanically remove additional recyclables that got thrown in trash cans and shouldn't have. And then the last step before you hit the landfill is you biologically stabilize the material. So you anaerobically digest it, or you can aerobically compost it, but that's not as effective. But then you're getting the methane generating potential out of that organic fraction, which means that your landfill is not going to be so gassy and stinky. And it's not even going to weigh as much because you got the water weight out of it before you ship it off to a landfill, depending on where this process happens. So then you capture the methane in an enclosed environment where you can capture it better than a landfill can with all of its wells and pipes that it uses to try to catch that gas. And then your landfill is going to be smaller, more stable, and less gassy, stinky, and leaky. So that's basically it.